All right, so let's look at sort of like the third aspect of Khrushchev's time in Russia. So we talked about his rise to power, we talked about his economic policies, and now let's look at his foreign policies, the relationship that he developed with the rest of the world and the Soviet learning objectives. So hopefully by the end of this, you will understand Khrushchev's foreign policy aims. You will be able to connect the impact of international issues on the foreign policy and the reverse to see how foreign policy of Khrushchev impacted the international situation, and then finally to assess the Khrushchev's foreign policy, that is, successes and failures. Before we start looking at Khrushchev's foreign policy, it's important to take a little bit of time and sort of review Stalin's. And this is just broadly, Stalin's foreign policy was monolithic. That is, there was only one way. And he didn't try to deal with different situations or different countries differently. It was all or nothing. Stalin's foreign policy was also risk adverse. A lot of it was reactive. A lot of it was trying to be defensive, protecting of the Soviet Union. So there weren't a huge amount of risk taking going on. And then Stalin's foreign policy was also all about conformity. So as we looked at in terms of how he treated Eastern Europe, it was creating a single, monolithic, unified, conforming system. And so the de-Stalinization that Khrushchev implemented, and also that secret speech, is going to necessitate some changes in the approach toward Eastern Europe, as well as the West and the developing world. And that is really what we're going to look at, is the form that those changes took. One of the things that changes is the approach towards the relationship with the West. And so under Khrushchev, you now have this idea of peaceful coexistence. So peaceful coexistence basically means that the war was no longer inevitable as a result of the capitalist world order. So essentially what Khrushchev is saying is that it is possible for these two systems to exist side by side, and they don't necessarily have to go to war. So basically he's stepping down from the sort of belligerent, antagonistic relationship with the West. And it's not because he doesn't believe that that communism and Soviet stuff is awesome, but he's trying to sort of reduce the security concerns and kind of reduce the sort of need to pump so much into maintaining security, and that would allow them to be able to shift some of that investment into the consumer sector. So this connects back to the desire in terms of the economic policies to improve living standards of people. And so one of the things that starts happening is that the government, of course, still has very firm control over the history of the country and the history that people are learning. This is TOK. This is TOK. And so now they start revising the history to show that this desire for peace was always what the Soviet system was all about. And so like the belligerence and the fighting, that is a reaction to what was happening abroad, not necessarily what it was all about. So this actually kind of goes back against the attempt to instigate communist revolutions in all of these various countries. And there is this recognition now that the Soviet Union is a nuclear power. One, they are strong, and so this is not something, that security issue isn't quite as big of a deal. But that war between the nuclear powers was unwinnable. So it's this recognition that they kind of have to back it down a little bit, because they could, annihilate. The thing, though, is that Khrushchev isn't backing down. He straight up believes that in all reality, the Soviet system is amazing and it's going to win out. They don't need to fight to push war out amongst people because the Soviet system has this awesome egalitarian ideology that creates equality between all of these people. And once he sorts out the economy and the world sees that the Soviet economic system is awesome, then why do they need to fight? Because it's gonna be irresistible to not only the ladies, but all of these other countries out there. One of the things to keep in mind is right now in the 50s, in the US, right, because this is their major competitor, in the US, the 50s is a very tumultuous time in which the civil rights movement is front and center. And there is, on the international stage, there's the visibility of huge portions of the US reacting negatively to other portions of the country attempting to gain equal rights. So Khrushchev is like, you know what? I don't need to do anything. All I need to do is focus on this economy, and y'all gonna win this war for me. And so, what the foreign policy is essentially going to do is make an attempt to increase Soviet influence abroad, but try to, at the same time, reduce the tension primarily between the US and Western Europe that could then lead to war. So the idea is to kind of use diplomacy rather than force to, get the Soviet brand out there. It's all about marketing. And but he needs to convince the whole world that Soviet Union is willing and capable to defend her interests. So as she is now going to be increasing her influence outside of the borders of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, people need to recognize. So like Khrushchev is all like, y'all need to recognize that the Soviet Union is hardcore. We're gonna make nice with people when we feel like making nice, but if you step on my toes, I'ma punch you. Trust me. So this foreign policy is really going to be attempting to do three things. One, this peaceful coexistence, find a way to live with the US and Western Europe, and this of course includes places like Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. So with these democratic capitalist countries, find a way to live with them without resorting to war. At the same time, allow some independence in world communism, so remove some of that monolithicness of Stalin's communism in Eastern Europe so that people can shape things a little bit more towards their needs. But at the same time, demonstrate to the rest of the world that the Soviet Union is a good ally to have. And part of that is they're going to be courting, that's right, yeah, the developing world to gain more influence, more allies abroad, and this would help the Soviet Union in international organizations like the United Nations, but also in terms of markets and resources. And one of this thing in this post-coexistence, as mentioned earlier, now that the USSR has nuclear technology, she is not just a regional power, but a world power. And kind of having that influence abroad is going to illustrate this. Overall, what happens is Khrushchev's foreign policy results in intervention in one part of the world, but it's going to create opportunities that benefit the Soviet Union, and also problems that kind of hinder some of this overall peaceful coexistence and things like this. So on one hand, it was like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or damned if you do, damned if you don't. Now, as we said, this new post-Stalin regime was a little uncertain, right? There is just kind of like this changeover from a system that they completely knew. And so, as we said, they're going to move away from that monolithic foreign policy of Stalin. The first things that they do is actually pressure China and North Korea to pull out of the Korean War. The U.S. is also looking to get out of this war, so it's one of those things where like they both agreed, and this kind of sets up the beginnings of peaceful coexistence and the U.S. and the Soviet Union kind of being able to get things done together when it counts. So first, they help end the Korean War. The other thing that they do is they remove themselves from Finland. As you remember, there was the Winter War, and Finland essentially lost, and the Soviet Union occupied some portions of Finland for protection. And so they get out of Finland, and this is two things, right? One, they were spending money on maintaining these bases that offered no real advantage to them anymore, because once Finland lost, they pushed the borders of Finland back. So in essence, once this war is over, there's no real need to spend the money. So it conferred no real advantages. At the same time, pulling out of it meant that the USSR had a much better image abroad, or rather, they could they could speak out loudly about, dude, we are so not even imperialists, because unlike the imperialist Americans, we don't have any military bases outside of our own country. So it's not like we are occupying people the way the Americans are. So this becomes a useful piece of propaganda in terms of helping their image abroad, and then also as they start reaching out to the developing world. And the other thing that happens in 1955, they accept the Austrian State Treaty. That is, Austria had been occupied essentially by the Allied powers since World War II. And this means that Austria now gains her independence as a state. And this was both a bit of a carrot for Germany. So in a way, they're trying to say, hey, Germany, if you do as Austria did, we will totally leave you alone, and you can be unified and get the rest of your state back. And this is also a really big benefit for the Soviet Union, is because one of the key aspects of the Austrian State Treaty was that Austria declares her neutrality forever. And so this means that near her border, even though Austria isn't an ally, Austria will never become an enemy. So it works out well in terms of helping to guarantee Soviet security, at the same time potentially trying to do the same thing for Germany. Does it work? No. But, hey, in the case of Germany. So we will stop here in our discussion about the peaceful coexistence, and the next video we'll look at the Warsaw Pact.